The fire was already burning. That was never the problem. Warm air rose off the flames and left through the open front of the shelter. Radiant heat traveled outward in straight lines, struck cold stone, and stopped being useful. A slow current moved along the floor and carried the heated air out into the dark. The fire was doing everything a fire does. The space around it was undoing most of it. This is a reconstruction, assembled from what excavators lifted out of the ground. It is not a record of one particular night. The place is real. Abri Castanet, a rock shelter in the Vézère valley of southwestern France. Cut into its limestone floor, more than 35,000 years ago, are 3 fire structures. The excavation numbered them 216, 217, and 218. Whatever warmth a group held through a cold season in that shelter. Most of it did not come from the flame. It came from what was built around the flame. That is a strange thing to say about fire. Fire is the oldest answer our species has to cold. It is the answer every reconstruction reaches for first, and the one every painting puts at the center of the frame, with the people arranged around it, like planets. But a flame in an open space is not a heating system. It is a source of energy that is losing. 3 things came out of the ground at Castanet, and each of them is a piece of the answer. 3 fire structures cut directly into bedrock. A set of stones carved with rings, whose purpose researchers argue about rather than agree on, and 1 small lamp that burned fat. None of those objects is a furnace. Together they describe something a furnace cannot. A space managed for heat and managed for light. The valley is narrow. Limestone cliffs run along the river, undercut at their base into long overhangs, and those overhangs are dry, sheltered from above, and open to the front. People use them for tens of thousands of years, which is why the sediment there is so thick and so complicated. The occupation layer at Castanet has been dated by radiocarbon to an average of about 32,400 years before present, uncalibrated, in plain terms, more than 35,000 years ago. The people were early modern humans. Their toolkit belongs to the period archaeologists call the aurignacian. The season is not a guess. Animal teeth carry growth layers in their cementum, and those layers record the season in which an animal died. 25 reindeer teeth and 1 horse tooth from the southern sector of the site were analyzed. They point to a cold season occupation. That single result changes what the fire structures mean. A hearth can serve heat, light, cooking, and material processing in any season. What cold season evidence changes is the stakes. Heating and fuel management stop being incidental benefits and become central possibilities. Everything else in this film follows from that one line of evidence in the teeth. One boundary matters before anything else. The phrase Ice Age covers a long stretch of time and a great range of climates. The coldest interval, when the northern ice sheets stood at their maximum positions, ran roughly from 26,500 to 19,000 years ago. Castanet is older than that. It is a cold four-season camp inside a glacial world, not a camp at the floor of the coldest phase. Our species has spent far more of its existence solving nights like that one than solving anything we would recognize as a modern problem. The solution left almost nothing behind. What it left is a set of holes cut in a rock floor. The first aurignacians at Castanet did with fire was fix it in place. Rather than scooping shallow hollows in loose sediment, they cut their fire features into the limestone bedrock itself. That is worth holding for a moment. Limestone is soft as rock goes. It is not soft as anything else goes. Cutting a basin into it is work, done with stone tools, low to the ground, by people who had other things waiting. it is also fixed. A hearth scraped into sediment leaves nothing binding behind it. A feature cut into bedrock ties fire use to one particular place on the shelter floor, and it stays tied. That is a spatial investment, and it is the part of the site that is not open to interpretation. That one choice exposes the logic underneath the site. A fire that can be moved serves whoever carries it. A fire cut into the floor serves the space. And the moment the space is the thing being served, the space becomes the thing being designed. The light leaves the top of the cliff first, and then the water. Below the overhang, stone holds the last of the day, slightly longer than the air does. The river keeps moving. Nothing in the valley marks the hour. The central arrangement at Castanet is not a hearth. It is three of them. Structures 216, 217, and 218 sit close enough together and relate to one another closely enough that the excavators treat them as a single complex rather than three separate fires that happen to share a floor. Almost everything that follows depends on that distinction. The analyses indicate that the three features were contemporaneous components of one large fire complex. Their relationship, rather than their mere proximity, is the question. The team that published the site proposed something specific about structure 217. In their reading, it may have burned more or less continuously through the cold season occupation. That is an interpretation offered by the excavators, and it has to be held as one. Sediment and residue can show that a feature was used heavily and repeatedly. They cannot timestamp a flame, and no method can. The archaeology is clear about the feature, but not about every behavior around it. The same team proposed a second thing, and it is the more revealing of the two. Material appears to have been moved out of 217 and into 216 and 218, either as cleaning or to supply tasks that needed controlled heat or a controlled flame away from the main fire. The wording in the paper is careful, and the care is the point. The contents of 216 are suspected to have come from 217 while still hot. Structure 218 may be a dump or an overflow. What the specialized tasks were, if there were specialized tasks, is undetermined. So the honest version is conditional. The pattern is consistent with hot residues being moved between linked features, possibly for cleaning, possibly to supply work that needed controlled heat away from the main fire. If that reading holds, heat at Castanet was being handled across a few meters of floor rather than only made in one spot. Nobody recovered a decision. What was recovered was burnt material sitting in a pit it does not appear to have started in. The rock basin does mechanical work regardless of who moved what. It holds a bed of coals in one shape instead of letting it spread across the floor, rather than merely hosting it. And it makes the same feature usable again, in the same footprint, without rebuilding anything. So the fire is shaped. It is anchored. It is divided between features whose relationship the excavators can describe, but not fully explain. And it is still losing. Radiation is the blunt part of the problem. Heat leaves a flame in every direction at once, and it weakens quickly with distance. Somebody sitting an arm's length from a fire and somebody sitting 3 paces back are not in the same climate. On a cold night, they are barely in the same room. Convection is worse and far less obvious. Hot air rises. In a shelter open at the front, air that rises off the fire has to be replaced. And what replaces it is cold air drawn in along the floor. The fire is not merely failing to warm the space. It is powering the exchange that empties. None of that is an archaeological claim. It is what fire does in every century, including in whatever room this is being watched in, which sets the real question. Not how to build a bigger fire, how to stop the space from spending it, Heat cannot be stockpiled. Whatever that shelter held on any given night, it held at the rate somebody was feeding it, and it began losing the moment it was made. The answer that survives is not a wall. It is a stone with a hole worked into it. Across the Vézère Valley, archaeologists have recovered a distinctive class of object, blocks and slabs with rings carved into them. In French, they are called pierres à anneaux, ringed stones. The French Ministry of Culture describes them as carved rings and connects them to the possibility of closing off or protecting a place of habitation. What is directly observable is narrow and useful. The aperture is real, and an opening of that kind could take a cord. What it was for is where the interpretations divide. The same ministry description notes that rings can also participate in the organization of engraved figures. So a fascinating role is one reading among several. At Castanet, the position of these stones led White and colleagues to support an older proposal, first advanced by Perroni, that the rings served as anchor points, and that hides were suspended or lashed to them to close the front of the shelter. Here's the evidence and the image part company, and the parting has to be said out loud. Not one fragment of that hide survives. Not a scrap. The stone does not preserve what was tied to it, or whether anything was. The hide wall is a hypothesis the research team finds well supported at this site. It is not an object anyone has recovered, but the physical consequences of hanging hide across a shelter mouth are not in dispute. Wind stops. That alone rewrites the arithmetic more than any change to the fire could, because moving air strips heat from a surface far faster than still air at the same temperature. A windbreak adds no calories at all to the shelter. It stops the shelter from being robbed of them, and radiant heat that would have crossed the open front and gone into the valley instead meets a surface and turns back inward. The excavators argue precisely this, that closing the shelter would have retained and reflected heat, not merely blocked the draft. So, the open in the first minute can be closed, as far as the ground allows it to be closed. The night stayed a problem with a fire already burning because a fire supplies heat at a finite rate, and an open shelter can lose it faster. Closing the shelter is the best supported answer to where that loss was slowed. It is an answer proposed by the team that excavated the site, resting on stone rings and on physics rather than on any surviving piece of the wall itself. It is not a fact anyone can hold in their hand, and a closed space is not a solved space. Close the front of a rock shelter, and three new problems arrive together. Smoke, which now has nowhere convenient to go. Darkness, because the same barrier that keeps heat in keeps daylight out. And a shelter that was dim at noon is now black. And the air itself, because incomplete combustion in an enclosed fire can produce carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that offers no sensory warning. Three problems, and all three were created by the solution to the first one. Any closure would therefore have required some way to manage smoke and airflow. What that way was, where the opening sat, how it vented, what was adjusted and when, is not preserved. The requirement is physical. The solution is missing. That is the shape of this whole story. Every solution creates the next problem, and each problem is harder than the one before it. There is a fourth problem, and the shelter cannot touch it at all. A closed shelter protects the volume of air inside it. It does nothing whatsoever for a body that leaves. Fuel, water, and animal resources lay beyond the protected volume. Anyone who went out stepped into the conditions the enclosure was meant to slow. The warmth in that shelter had a radius. Past it, 35,000 years ago, the valley did not know the fire existed. An intensive fire complex used during a cold season occupation is not a single event. It creates a recurring provisioning problem. The excavators state the source ceiling directly. Maintaining an intensive fire complex of this kind required a substantial and recurring provisioning cost. That is the finding. The routes, the storage practices, and how that labor was divided are all unknown. But the ceiling still says something. Fuel is consumed as it delivers heat. So, cost like that cannot be paid once and then forgotten. Some part of that group's effort had to be committed repeatedly while those features were in use. And not all fuel is equal. Wet or green wood burns inefficiently, spending part of its energy driving off moisture, producing more smoke and less useful heat. Which fuel a fire receives is not a neutral detail. And none of that appears in any painting of people sitting around a flame. Inside the overhang, the light arrives sideways, and only for part of the day. The rock face runs back into shadow. Nothing here moves except the light, and it moves slowly, and then it is gone. So what were they burning? The honest answer starts with an admission about preservation. Wood is thought to have played an important role at Castanet, and it may be underrepresented in what survives. Because charcoal fragments scatters and degrades in ways heavier residues do not. The material that survives best is not necessarily the material that mattered most. That is a standing hazard across the whole discipline. And it is about to matter enormously, because this leads directly into the most persistent idea in Ice Age archaeology, and into one of its most instructive corrections. Burned bone turns up in Paleolithic hearths constantly. In 2010, a study of hearth fuel at Abri Pataud, another rock shelter in the same valley system, read the residues there as evidence that bone had been used as a major fuel during the coldest phases of the sequence. The idea is attractive. Cold, open landscape, few trees, enormous quantities of animal bone, lying around every camp. It fits together so cleanly that it escaped the specialist literature entirely and became the standard explanation in popular accounts, where it remains. In 2020, Braadbaart and colleagues went back to Pataud with a multi-proxy approach, reconstructing the heating histories of the fireplaces themselves, the taphonomy of what had ended up inside them. The results did not support the earlier interpretation. The reading of bone as a major fuel at Pataud was not confirmed. What the study did report was evidence for the use of dung as fuel. The scale of the site is why this carries weight. Pataud preserves 52 hearth structures through its stratigraphic sequence. Traces of heating appear in 17 of 26 archaeological and Abulis levels. Its basin hearths are commonly 3 to 8 centimeters deep and around 80 centimeters across, though the full range runs wider than that. This is one of the best sampled fire records in Upper Paleolithic Europe, and it did not confirm the story almost everyone had already accepted. What changed was not the bone. What changed was the standard of proof. A burned bone in a hearth is not the same thing as a bone chosen as fuel. Bone arrives in a fire for many reasons that have nothing to do with heating. It is dropped in as waste. It is swept in when a hearth is cleaned. It is roasted with meat still attached, and then stays where it falls. The residue can look much the same. The behavior behind it does not. At Castanet itself, the assessment runs in the same careful direction. Bone contributed to some fire use at the site. That is not enough to call bone the main fuel, and wood remained important. There is a second reason the residue is hard to read. A hearth deposit is a filtered record of combustion, of cleaning, of trampling, and of burial. Counts of burned bone alone cannot show that bone was chosen as fuel. That is precisely why Braadbaart and colleagues did not rely on one line of evidence. Reconstructing what a fireplace burned and how hot it ran took several independent proxies read against each other. The deposit is still a record. It is just not a transcript. And a boundary. because it matters more here than anywhere else in this film. Everything in the last 3 minutes came from Abri Pataud. Pataud is not Castanet. Different shelter, different sequence, different fires, different centuries, stacked in a different order. It is used here because it corrects an interpretation, not because a fuel record can be carried a few kilometers along a valley and dropped onto another site. That correction also closes the second question this film opened. Why 3 structures? The answer available is the one the excavators proposed. One feature that may have burned more or less continuously, with material moved into the other 2, either to clean the main fire or to serve tasks needing heat and flame under tighter control. The evidence supports heat management, not a cinematic schedule invented for the camp. That fuel is not a neutral detail has actually been measured, and it is worth separating carefully from Castanet. In 2020, Hoare burned 8 types of wood and fresh bone in open-air experimental hearths, recording what each one delivered: radiative heat output on one axis, luminosity on the other. The profiles separate. Fuels do not simply burn more or less. They burn differently, and they deliver different proportions of heat and light, which means there is no best fuel in the abstract. There is only the fuel that suits what is being asked of a fire. Something that throws heat is not necessarily something that throws usable light. That experiment says nothing about why Castanet had 3 linked structures. It was not designed to. It tested materials in open air, not a sheltered rock-cut hearth 35,000 years ago, and not the allocation of tasks at any site. The principle transfers. Those numbers, and any explanation built on them, do not. So, 2 different sources say 2 different things, and only together do they say anything. The excavation says these features were linked and may have served different purposes. The experiment says the material fed into a fire changes what comes out of it. Neither one alone reaches the night, which leaves the problem no shelter can reach. Somebody who steps beyond the fire's radius carries no heat but their own. Whatever protects them out there has to travel, sit against the skin, and keep working without attention for as long as they are gone. Something did that job. It is not in the Castanet Fire Complex report. And this is the point in the film where the anchor has to be set down and picked back up carefully. Clothing is organic. Hide, sinew, cord, and fur decay. And no garment survives from this period anywhere in Europe. What survives is the equipment used to work skin, and that equipment is recovered across Eurasia from many sites and many thousands of years, rather than from this one floor. Bone awls come first, and they are the underrated tool. An awl pierces hide. Pierced hide can be laced. Laced hide can be shaped to a body, rather than draped over it. And a garment that fits behaves differently from a garment that hangs, because the air inside it stops circulating. Gilligan and colleagues make the point directly. Awls were being used to produce fitted garments long before the eyed needle appears at all. So the careful statement for Castanet is this: fitted or laced garments were technologically possible in this period, because the piercing tools that make them exist elsewhere in the record, whether the people using this shelter had them, and what those garments look like, the site does not say. The eyed needle is a different matter, and the dates are worth stating plainly, because this is exactly where prehistoric documentaries go wrong, including, very nearly, this one. A needle with an eye merges 2 motions that had been separate, piercing the hide, and, drawing the thread through the hole, become a single pass. That makes fine sewing faster, and much more controlled. But it does not belong in this shelter. In the review Gilligan and colleagues, published in 2024, the earliest eyed needles appear in Siberia, around 40,000 years ago, in the Caucasus around 38,000, and in Europe, only by about 26,000 years ago. Castanet is more than 35,000 years old. The Iced Needles reaches Europe roughly 10,000 years after those fires went out. In archaeological terms, that is not a small gap. Putting a needle in that camp is not a small liberty. It is a different world. What Gilligan and colleagues propose about the needle is also a hypothesis rather than a finding, and it is a review of many sites rather than an excavation of one. Their reading is that the advantage lies in finer, closer work, including the possibility of layered garments, with an inner layer worn against the skin. No Paleolithic underwear has been excavated. Direct evidence for multi-layer assemblages remains limited, and they present it as an interpretation of the technology, not as a description of anybody's wardrobe. The physics underneath it is not controversial. Much of a garment's insulation comes from the still air held within and between its layers. Those layers reduce air movement near the body, and a close fit limits the exchange of warmed air with colder air outside. A fitted garment is, in the most literal sense, a shelter small enough to walk in. It has a heat source inside it, which is the body, and its entire function is to slow the rate at which that source is spent. Like the shelter, it also demands maintenance. Hide has to be worked and kept supple. Seams fail. A tear in a cold season is a hole in the only portable shelter a person owns. That is a property of the technology, not a scene anyone has excavated. Researchers can measure the hearth. They cannot name the person who fed it, and they cannot dress that person either. The tools are real, and they are recovered in numbers across Eurasia. The clothing is organic, and everywhere in this period it is gone. No direct garment survives in the European record from this period. The thing built to keep people alive survives worse than the stone used to work it. So the picture now holds a fire that could be shaped, spurs, a space that could be closed, fuel that had to be replaced continuously, and a body that the period's technology could insulate. And not one of those things does anything by itself. Lay the castanet objects out on a table, a pit cut into rock, a stone with a ring worked into it, a small lamp of stone, and a hide that no longer exists, which is not an object at all but an argument. The clothing does not go on this table. It belongs to a wider Eurasian record, and putting here would be the same error the last chapter just spent 5 minutes avoiding. Every item that does belong here is a separate technology, solving a separate part of the problem. Different materials, different skills. The site cannot say how many makers were involved, and not one of them manages heat. A pit does not gather fuel. A ring does not hang a hide. A lamp does not fill itself. Objects sit still. They hold the possibility of work, and they wait for somebody. What links them is the only thing that can link them. People, carrying out different kinds of work around the same fire-centered space, whether at the same moment or at different points in the occupation, using knowledge that had to be learned, rather than supplied by the objects themselves, which would mean the heating technology at Abri Castanet was never an object at all. It was distributed, held partly in stone, partly in materials that have not survived, and mostly in people who knew what each of those things was for. That is the turn this film is built on, and it has to be labeled honestly. Nobody excavated coordination. What was excavated was pits, residues, ring stones, tools, and a lamp. Reading those objects as a single coordinated practice is a synthesis, this film's interpretation of the site, not a conclusion announced by the excavation. Each component carries a different level of evidential support, and several are hypotheses resting on other hypotheses. What survives is the system's footprint, not a record of a single night. The reading is not invented from nothing. Follows. Paleolithic archaeology has been describing for years. In 2022, Clark, Ranlett, and Steiner published an argument in the Journal of Human Evolution that domestic space itself functions as a crucible of Paleolithic culture. Their case is that hearth-centered space concentrates several things at once: work, food processing, social interaction, and the transmission of knowledge between people. That last one deserves its own weight. None of the techniques this film has described is supplied by the objects themselves. Cutting a basin into limestone, judging which fuel is worth carrying, working a hide without ruining it. Each depends on accumulated experience that could pass from one person to another in a domestic space where work was visible. That is a general pattern recognized across many sites and a long span of time. It is not a behavioral map of Castanet, and it assigns nobody a role, and it points at the strangest property of this entire system. None of the knowledge is in the objects. A stone lamp carries no instruction for using it. A pit does not record how it was fed. Techniques of that kind exist only inside people, and they leave the world when those people do, unless they are handed on first. The stone survived 35,000 years. Whatever knowledge made the stone useful had a lifespan of one generation, renewed constantly, or lost. But it reframes what a hearth can be, not simply a heat source that people gather around, potentially the organizing point that makes several kinds of work possible in one place. In a season when working in the open exposes a body to faster heat loss, what Castanet itself preserves is narrower than that, and the narrowness matters. The excavation recovered debris from a range of activities around the fire features. It did not recover the people, the roles, or the schedule. Nobody can say who was present, how many, or what was happening at the same time as what. What can be said is structural rather than biographical. Work that needs heat or light has to happen where heat or light is. And heat and light arrive at whatever rate the fire is being fed, which is why the suspected movement of material between 216, 217, and 218 carries more weight than its size suggests. If hot residues really were shifted between linked features, then something more than combustion was going on. Cleaning implies maintenance, though not a known duration. A fire whose material ends up somewhere else may be a fire serving more than one purpose. If that reading holds, it is a form of allocation. Heat put where it was wanted, rather than only where it was made. But the excavators claim no such thing directly. They recovered residues in a pit. Those residues do not appear to have started in, and they said what that is consistent with. It also changes what the shelter is. A place to escape weather is a shelter. A place where fire and portable light concentrate tool production, pigment work, food preparation, and other activities is something else. It is a working domestic space, and warmth is part of what makes that work possible. None of this was inevitable, and it is worth saying why. Fire technology in the Upper Paleolithic did not develop along a single rising line. Murphy and Aldeus, reviewing European pyrotechnology in 2022, describe a record that is uneven and complicated, with practices appearing, disappearing, and reappearing across regions and periods. Capability is not the same as continuity. What one group knew, the next group in the same valley did not automatically inherit. So this is not a story about the discovery of fire. That happened enormously earlier. And it is a different film entirely. This is a story about what one group did with a capability their ancestors had held for hundreds of thousands of years, and about what it cost them to run it through a cold season in one narrow valley. Fire had been in human hands for longer than our species has existed. What survives at Castanet is not the beginning of that story, or the end of it. It is one narrow window onto what a single group had made of it by then. Winter daylight withdraws early from the shelter. A band of light remains along the upper cliff after the floor beneath the overhang has fallen into shadow. Under the rock, darkness settles before the open sky is gone. And then there is the object that changes the shape of the night. Associated with structure 218 at Castanet, excavators recovered a portable lamp that burned fat. It is easy to walk straight past it. It is a small stone with a hollow in it, and it looks like nothing at all. But consider what it does that a hearth cannot. A hearth is fixed. Everything it illuminates is illuminated because it is close to the hearth, which means the geometry of the fire dictates the geometry of the work. The lamp breaks that. Light becomes a thing that can be picked up, carried into a corner, held close to a piece of work, taken to the back of the shelter, where the fire does not reach. The consequence is stated carefully in the literature, and it will be stated carefully here, for White and colleagues describe portable light as complementing hearth light during long winter nights, illumination that could go where the fire could not. Could not did on any given evening for any named purpose, because that is the boundary. The lamp is real, and it was recovered in context. Its usefulness is not in question. What nobody can recover is what was done by its light, how long it burned, how much fuel it held, or how often it was lit at all. Those things are not in the ground, and the contrast is narrower than a documentary would like it to be. A hearth already gives light, and work near a hearth does not stop at sunset. What the lamp changes is not whether the night could be used. It is where in the shelter it could be used. So the loop closes here, and it closes smaller than it opened. Darkness became usable time through an object that separated light from fire. How much of that time was used? And for what? The ground does not say, and it never will. The archaeology is clear about the feature, but not about every behavior around it. A shallow hollow worked into a piece of stone let light leave the fire. It is one of the least impressive objects ever lifted out of that valley, and one of the most consequential, which raises the last honest question. It is the one the ground answers worst of all. To understand what is missing at Castanet, it helps to look at a place where it is not missing. Hollow 2 lies on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. The site burned, and then it was flooded, and that combination preserved organic material of kind that almost never survives anywhere. 6 brush huts were preserved there. 4 of their floors were excavated in full, and on those floors, published by Nadel and colleagues in 2004, was bedding, bundles of grass, laid in an arranged pattern, coated with clay, lying around a central hearth, and concentrated close to the walls. That is what a sleeping arrangement looks like. Not inferred, not proposed, recovered, mapped and photographed. Sites like that are rare enough to distort the whole picture. Grass, hide, cord, wood and thread ordinarily disappear long before archaeologists arrive. They survive where unusual conditions intervene, including waterlogging, rapid burial or charring, which means much of the everyday material of prehistoric life is visible only through exceptional preservation. The boundary has to be drawn immediately, and drawn hard. Hollow 2 is a different region, a different environment, and a later period, roughly 23,000 years ago, against Castanet's 35,000 and more. It shows what preservation is capable of. It is not a floor plan that can be laid over a French rock shelter and read as though it were the same building, because Castanet does not preserve the same sleeping map. The sleeping map is gone, and with it goes almost everything a film like this would most like to show. Where people slept in relation to the fire, unknown. Whether they slept as one group or several, unknown. Whether anybody stayed awake to tend the fire, and whether that duty rotated between people, there is no evidence for it at the site. and inventing one would mean filling a gap with atmosphere. What animals came near the camp after dark? Fur. And whether they were a threat that shaped where people slept. Not established by the site evidence, and not something this film will supply. Each of those gaps has an obvious, satisfying answer available. Each of those answers would be invented. And the temperature. The number everyone wants. Reconstructions of European winter. Cooling during the last glacial period. Depend on which model is used, and which proxies are read. And Ramstein and colleagues showed in 2007 that those reconstructions disagree with one another and have been substantially revised. There is no site-specific reconstruction precise enough to attach a figure to a night at Castanet, and any figure offered would be theater. Colder than today. Cold enough that occupying the place in that season made sustained management of heat and light valuable. That is the honest ceiling, and pretending otherwise would cost more than it bought. The surviving floor is stone and sediment. Organic walls, bedding and clothing are absent. What remains is shallow, hard, and capable of holding the shapes cut into it. The limits of interpretation are not unique to Castanet, and one comparison makes that plain. At Kostenki 11, in Russia, a circular structure, built of mammoth bone, was investigated by Pryor and colleagues and published in 2020. It contained charcoal, burnt bone, and microdebitage. It is a genuinely spectacular thing to stand in front of, and its function is still argued. Whether it served as a long-term winter dwelling remains open, and the 2020 study weighed other possibilities. Even a visually dramatic Ice Age structure can be one whose purpose researchers decline to state with confidence. That should be reassuring rather than disappointing. It is what a discipline looks like when it refuses to fill a gap with the version that films best. There is one further limit, and it is structural rather than accidental. An occupation surface is not a night. It is the compressed sum of many visits, separated by time that left no trace, flattened into a single readable layer. Objects that appear to sit beside one another may have been dropped decades apart. A hearth used across a season records the season, not the evening. That is not a flaw in the excavation. It is a property of time. Sediment accumulates far more slowly than people live. So a year and a decade arrive in the ground, looking much alike, which means the system described in this film, the shaped fire, the proposed closure, the recurring need for fuel, the periods, clothing technology, and the carried light, was never observed operating together on any one night by anyone, including the people who dug it up. What survives is the system's footprint, not a record of a single night. Most of what was soft and perishable disappeared. What remained was the rock, which is to say the part that may have mattered least to the people using it. So follow one unit of heat through the whole system and watch where it goes. It begins as fuel gathered beyond the shelter. Finding it and carrying it back are part of the significant provisioning cost identified by the excavators. The routes, distances, and storage practices are not preserved. It enters a pit cut into limestone. The fire releases the energy in one pass, and no energy can be released twice. Most of it radiates outward. It crosses a few meters of air, weakening as it goes. Some may strike a hide, hung on a stone ring, and turn back into the shelter, instead of leaving into the valley. If the closure hypothesis holds, a fraction reaches a body. There it meets the last barrier, a garment holding a layer of still air against skin, of a kind the piercing tools of the period made possible, though not one recovered here. And the fraction that gets that far does one job. It keeps a body above the point where the body would otherwise start spending itself to stay warm. Everything before that point is loss management. Everything after it is the reason any of it was worth doing. The rest escapes. It warms air that leaves, and it ends up spread thin across the valley, indistinguishable from the night it was supposed to hold off. The whole arrangement exists to intercept a little of it on the way out. Then that body works. It carries fuel, tends a fire, and uses the light. A shared space concentrates activity, so that heat and light released once can serve more than one person and more than one purpose before they are finally lost. At every one of those transfers, some energy escapes. The system does not stop the loss. It slows losses at several stages, and it can what remains to more than one use before it goes. Last part is the piece most reconstructions miss. The same fire that provides warmth can also provide light and cooking heat. One release of energy, several possible returns. Using a single release for several activities could raise the value obtained from scarce fuel. But by how much? The site cannot say, and no experiment in this film measured it. One question sits behind all of it, and nothing inside this shelter can settle it. Whether what was recovered here belonged to this group alone. That is the answer to the question this film started with. They stayed warm by managing 5 connected parts of the problem: capture, placing and shaping the fire so that heat, flame and coals could be controlled rather than merely produced. Containment, the proposed hide closure, which would have slowed wind-driven heat loss if the interpretation is correct. Fuel, finding and carrying enough combustible material, and absorbing the recurring labor cost while the fire complex was in use. Insulation, portable clothing, of a kind the period's hide-working technology made possible, though Castanet preserves no garment. And organization, arranging activity around the hearth so that the same heat and light could support more than one purpose. Take any one of those away, and the rest degrade. Fire without closure loses heat to the valley. Closure without airflow creates a smoke and carbon monoxide hazard. A fire without continued provisioning goes out. Clothing slows bodily heat loss, but does not heat the shelter. The parts answer different losses, which is why the answer is less satisfying than the one people expect. A story about survival wants an object in it, a discovery, a moment, somebody being clever. What the ground at Castanet supports, instead, is a footprint, consistent with several ordinary techniques being combined, no one of them decisive alone. It looks less like an invention than like a job. Nobody in that shelter defeated the cold. They lost heat more slowly than the night could take it. And they did that for as long as that cold season occupation lasted. Whether the same people came back in later years is not something the layer can resolve. Morning comes into the shelter along the ground. The ash holds its shape in the basin, gray and undisturbed. Outside, the valley is exactly as it was, which leaves one question standing. A single site can be an accident. One unusually organized group, in one unusually good shelter, in one good season, could leave a pattern like this in the ground. A second site cannot prove every interpretation at the first. But repetition can test whether the floor plan was isolated. So is Castanet a clever camp, or is it a pattern? There is an answer, and it comes from a few kilometers away. Castanet sits at Sarjac in the Castel Merle Valley. Abri Cellier lies several kilometers down the Vézère system at Le Ruth in Tursac, a separate shelter and excavation. There, excavators documented a fire arrangement nearly identical to Castanet's. The same size and spatial orientation. 2 sites. Same period. Same valley system. Several kilometers apart. The same spatial arrangement built into the floor. That repetition is what turns a description into a pattern. Hence, White and colleagues treat the repeated arrangement as evidence for systematic fire management in the early Aurignacian, possibly part of a wider regional practice. The ground cannot show who copied whom, why the arrangement persisted, or how the knowledge moved between groups. Whatever knowledge produced the arrangement was carried by people, rather than by the stone itself. It was repeated often enough to leave the same spatial pattern in the floors of two different shelters. Any hides and clothing used there are gone. The fuel is gone, the people are gone, and no single night can be reconstructed from what remains. Cut into the floor of Abri Castanet, 3 shapes are still there: 216, 217, and 218. Still exactly where somebody decided the heat should be.